All right, so we'll go ahead and get started. I'm Michelle Rosen. I'm the Queen's Arts Fund Grant Program Manager at Queen's Council on the Arts. I'll be using QAF to refer to Queen's Arts Fund and QCA to refer to Queen's Council on the Arts throughout this meeting, just so folks don't get confused. So this session is for the New Work Grant today. It's for individual artists and collaborations between multiple artists. If you're an organization or you're interested in the Arts Access Grant for organizational support, this meeting will not cover that grant, but we will have another info session next week for the Arts Access Grant. And if you attended last week's New Work info session, this is mostly a repeat of that info session. You're welcome to stay if you want to, but just a heads up, it'll be the same information that we went over last week. So starting off, again, this is for the New Work Grant for Queen's Arts Fund. Thank you everyone for joining this info session. I really appreciate you taking the time to learn about the grant. And we'll go through a little bit of an overview of Queen's Arts Fund, the grant, and then we'll walk through the grant application, and we'll have some time for questions and some breaks in between. And can everyone hear me all right? Great, thank you. All right, so as I said, this is an agenda for today's session. We'll first go over eligibility guidelines and the grant requirements. We'll take some time for questions about those. And then we'll go through the application and take some application specific questions. And if you have any specific questions throughout this session about your project, feel free to email me, but please save those for emails. I can't answer any specific project questions during this session. And before we begin, I'm just going to drop some links in the chat, including my email, a link to the QCA website, and the New Work guidelines, as well as a link to the application. And I'll share that throughout the meeting as well, in case folks miss it. Great, so what is Queen's Council on the Arts? We are a arts nonprofit organization acting as an arts council for Queens County, and we offer professional development workshops, arts and education workshops, and commissioning programs. Right now, our programs that are running are the High School to Art School, which offers portfolio support and application support to high school students applying to art school. They're also looking for new teaching artists. So if anyone is looking for an opportunity, please apply. And then Queen's Arts Fund, which this is about, and we'll go more into that, but it's QCA's general grants program. And then the Artist Commissioning Program, which acts to serve as a way to democratize art commissioning by bringing in art commissioners who will fund projects in their neighborhood in Queens. Great. So what is Queen's Arts Fund? It is Queen's Arts Fund offers project-based grants to Queens-based artists, collectives, and small organizations. These are public grants, and the purpose of these grants are to really support and bolster local making, production of art, and also support organizations and folks in planning and producing cultural programs that really show the diversity of Queens and the vibrancy of the Queensborough. And the applications for Queen's Arts Fund grants this year is February 14th at 11:59 p.m. So please make sure you submit your application before then. And I definitely recommend getting a head start if you haven't already. Great. So where do these funds come from for QAF? This year, Queen's Arts Fund is supported by DCLA, the Department of Cultural Affairs, in partnership with the City Council. So that means that these grants are publicly funded by the city. They're re-grants, and because they're public grants, they have certain requirements, but really it's public funds going to Queens artists and organizations. This year, we're offering 2 grants, the Arts Access Grant for organizations and artist collectives applying with fiscal sponsorship. Those grants range from $1,000 to $5,000. And then also the Newark grant, which this session is about, grants are at $3,000. And a little overview of the timeline for this year cycle. In January, we have info sessions and one-to-one review sessions. If you're a first-time applicant to QAF or you have applied in the past but you haven't received funding, we have one-to-one sessions open. You can go on our website and schedule an appointment. I'll drop a link in the chat to schedule one later in this meeting, but those can be really helpful. We'll sit down, go through a draft of your application together, and I'll suggest sending you in for clarity, or if there's any holes in your application that make things a little bit, may seem missing, and just to strengthen your application narrative overall. And then the deadline, as I said, is February 14th. In March, we'll review applications for eligibility and completeness. So any application that either the applicant is not eligible or the project isn't eligible, we'll reach out to applicants to, if there's any project eligibility issues, but if you're not eligible as an applicant, you won't make it to panels, and non-complete applications also cannot be reviewed by panelists. So please make sure that everything is complete and ready before you submit your application. And then in April, panels convene, so panelists will pre-score applications and then meet virtually to discuss them. And in June, funding notifications will be sent. So that's to applications that are applicants who are both awarded the QF grant, and also if you were declined a QF grant, you'll still receive a notification of panelist termination. Great, so getting into what the Newark grant is about. So the Newark grant supports Queens-based individual artists and collaborations between artists of all artistic disciplines in their creation and public sharing of new work. And what is new work in our terms? It's work that hasn't been produced yet, you haven't made it, or it's work in progress that you haven't shown to a public audience before. So perhaps it is work that is something you've been working on. Maybe you worked on it last year, but you've never shown it to anyone. It's not finished. And you want to request Newark grant funding to help you finish that project and present it to an audience, or it's something that you haven't made yet and you're planning on making this year in 2022, and you also will share it with a public audience. Great, and then who is eligible to apply for this grant? You must live in Queens or have a full-time studio lease in Queens. And we will ask if you are awarded to show proof of residency or a studio lease. You can also apply as an artist collective or a collaboration. And if you're applying as a collaboration, you'll select one person in that group to be the lead applicant. And the lead applicant has to meet all the eligibility requirements that an individual artist applying to the Newark grant meets. It's okay if someone else in your group is not based in Queens, but at least one person has to be based in Queens and meet all of the eligibility requirements. And then, like I said, any artistic discipline is accepted. It's very broad. And really, if you consider art, I would say it is probably a good fit for the Newark grant. If you have any uncertainty, if it is eligible, feel free to email me. And you must be at least 18 years old to apply to this grant. Great, so who can't apply to the Newark grant? So any past recipients of Queen's Arts Fund who haven't submitted a final report or are out of compliance with their cultural contract, unless you have a granted extension. Also, Queen's Arts Fund recipients from 2021 are not eligible to apply this year. You must take a break for a year and you're eligible to apply again in 2023. Students, either full or part-time, who are currently enrolled at the time of application cannot apply. If you are a student in a group, but your lead applicant, again, is not a student, they can apply. It's okay if you're part of that group, but you yourself cannot serve as the lead applicant. And just want to loop back, when I say lead applicant, that person is the person who will fill out their information on the application, and they'll also remain the main contact throughout the year for your project. Artists who receive funding, sorry, we already went over that. And then individual artists or artist collectives who are applying with an organization in partnership for the 2022 Arts Access Grant. So you can't apply to both grants in a year. You can only apply to one grant, either the Newark grant or the Arts Access Grant. Again, if you are approached by an organization to be a participating artist, but you're not applying to the Arts Access Grant, you're not leading that project, that's still okay. You just can't apply as both the lead applicant and an applicant for the Newark grant and Arts Access Grant. And then you can apply to DCLA funds in another county or borough. And so, for example, if you have a studio lease in Queens, but you have an address in Brooklyn, if you've already applied for a Brooklyn Arts Fund grant, you're not eligible to apply to this grant. And that's regardless if you receive funding for the grant. You cannot apply to both. You can apply to Queens Arts Fund if you did receive a City Artist Corps grant last year. And if they open that this year, hopefully they do, you're still eligible. That's a separate grant and it's not considered, it's not from the same funding source, so to say. So you're still eligible to apply to the Newark grant, even if you have received a City Artist Corps grant or plan on applying this year if they do open applications. And just want to go back that if you applied to an individual artist grant at Flushing Town Hall this year, as the NISCA funded grants have moved to Flushing Town Hall, you're still eligible to apply to Queens Arts Fund. The two grants, Queens Arts Fund grants and Flushing Town Hall grants, are funded by separate sources. QAF is funded by the city, as I said, and Flushing Town Hall grants are funded by the state. So you're still eligible to apply if you've applied to Flushing Town Hall in December. Great. And so what kind of projects can you apply to the Newark grant with? You can apply for a single piece of work or a series of new work. So it can be as simple as applying with, you want to create a song and perform that song, or you're creating an album and you plan to record and present that album. It can be really any range of work as long as it's new work, as we said. And then another important part of the Newark grant is the public component. So you have to have a public component that takes place within the Queensborough in 2022. And the point of that public component should be to bring Queens community members with high quality opportunity to experience dynamic, easily accessible arts and cultural events. So this grant's purpose is twofold. It's to support your production of new work, and it's also to bring exciting, really culturally community relevant arts and culture events to folks in Queens. And then what can these grant funds be used for? You can use it for artist compensation, to pay yourself and to pay any collaborators or technical assistants that you bring into your project. And we strongly suggest that you use the grant fund to at least, or use the grant fund in part to use it towards artist compensation. Please pay yourself for your work. Marketing and publicity costs, supplies, materials, and equipment. So for that, as long as the individual item is less than $1,000, it's eligible, but you cannot use the grant, so to say, to spend $3,000 to purchase a printer if you wanted. And then venue rental, if you're planning on having your public event or sharing of work in person, grant funds can be used to rent a space. They can also be used to rent a studio that's specific to making the project. So let's say your project is a large sculptural piece and you don't have the space to create that work where you normally make work. You can use it for a temporary studio to make that specific project, but grant funds cannot be used towards general rent, home rent, or general studio rent that you will have throughout the year. It has to be project specific. And then going a little more into what the grant cannot fund. And as a reminder, projects that, or applications that include projects that propose uses of grant funds that are not eligible will not be able to receive the new work grant, even, and they won't make to panel. So what can't this grant fund? Any projects that exclude the general public. So for your public component, if you can host a workshop, but if that workshop is members only or requires a membership fee to be part of it, that is not eligible for this grant. Any recreational, religious, or therapeutic art programs or commercial art are not eligible. So this can't be used to make advertisements. And for therapeutic art programs or recreational religious, it's okay if it's a bit of a component, but for example, you cannot use this grant to produce an art therapy workshop for clients. It can incorporate mental health, but it has to be open to the general public. And then fellowships, scholarships, residence fees, or re-grant funds. So this grant essentially cannot be used to fund your own grant program. It can't be re-granted out to folks or used to pay other people in terms of a fellowship. So you can pay folks for their work, but you cannot produce your own grant program, so to say, or fellowship program with these grant funds. Can't be used for startup costs for new collectives or organizations. Any in-school arts education programs or activities are not eligible. So you can have, you can apply for funding with a project that is an after-school event. So let's say you want to host a workshop that takes place at Queens College. If it's after hours and it's open to the general public, that is permissible. But if it's for Queens College students, for example, that is not, and it doesn't allow the general public to join, that's not eligible for this grant. And lastly, anyone who's 18 years, who's under the age of 18 years old cannot be paid to be part of your project. and it can't be used for out-of-state travel. And I encourage everyone to read thoroughly the eligibility guidelines before starting the application and before sending your application in. If anything is uncertain, you have any specific questions about your own eligibility, please reach out to me over email before you send in your application. That way we can figure out things before you submit. Great, so who determines which applications are funded? Applications are reviewed each year by a peer panel. So these are folks who are Queens or familiar with Queens communities. You don't have to be based in Queens, but familiarity with Queens is necessary. They're artists, cultural workers, and community leaders who have deep working knowledge and relationships with other Queens artists and community members. And so you can nominate yourself to be a panelist. Even if you're applying, you, if chosen to be a panelist, would review applications in a panel separate from that which your application is being reviewed in, nominate people you know in your community, and the nomination form is found on Submittable, the same link that you can find the newer grant application. And how does the panel process work? So at the end of March, panelists are notified, or nominated panelists are notified if they've been selected to serve as panelists. And then you'll get about 20 to 30 applications to pre-score and read over before meeting in virtual panel sessions in the spring. And QCA staff administers grants, so we help facilitate the process, but we do not make any funding decisions. And after panels convene, panelists make recommendations as to which grants are funded, or sorry, which applications will receive funding, and ultimate approval is made by QCA's Board of Trustees. And this year we have about $460,000 to re-grant for both grants, the Newark grant and Arts Access grant. And probably around 105 applications will receive funding, which is how many were funded last year in 2021. And that's for $3,000 grants for this Newark grant. Great, so panelists score applications based on evaluation criteria and in line with eligibility guidelines, but we'll go into evaluation criteria a little bit after Q&A about eligibility once we walk through the application. But QAF also has funding priorities for this grant. And what are those? So in the past, Black, Indigenous, and Latina applicants and applicants based in South Queens, Rockaways, and East Queens neighborhoods have historically received limited or low funding in past grant cycles for QAF and will be prioritized in the 2022 panel process. And the evaluation criteria incorporates these funding priorities, but panelists are also asked to keep these funding priorities in mind when reviewing applications. Also, projects that are easily accessible to all types of audiences in terms of disability, culture, geography, and economic accessibility. So do these projects really make an effort to ask what their audience's access needs are? Are they free or sliding scale, meaning they range from maybe $5 to $10 admissions? Are they easy to access by public transportation? Are they culturally accessible? Do they center maybe non-Western, non-European cultural traditions? or reiterations of cultural traditions? Are they accessible to folks with disabilities, both physical disabilities or learning disabilities? So these are not requirements of this grant, but we really look for projects that do allow everyone to experience your project or your public event, that there aren't barriers to experiencing that. And then applicants who, if awarded, would be first-time Queen's Arts Fund recipients. So folks who have not received funding from Queen's Arts Fund, they haven't received a Newark grant in the past or an Arts Access grant, and this will be their first time being funded by QAF. And I'm seeing a lot of questions in the chat, and we will take them now. And so I'll read through these questions in the chat first, and then open the floor for folks to ask questions over video. And then we'll take about a 5-minute break before going into the application walkthrough. But if you need to step away for any reason, please do. The session's being recorded and will be sent out next week. So please take care of what you need to if you need to take a break, not at the time that we take it. Great, so I'm just going to share the links that I shared before in the chat before we get into questions. Those are my email, a link to the application, our website, and the Newark guidelines. So someone asked, are you ineligible if you received a NYFA grant in 2021? You are eligible for a Queen's Arts Fund. NYFA grant is separate, even though it's funded by the city. It's separate from the re-grant funds that Queen's Arts Fund is administering. So you can apply this year for a Queen's Arts Fund grant, even if you received a grant from NYFA. And NYFA grants, I believe there's an opportunity open right now for $7,000 artist support. I encourage folks to apply, and you are still eligible, again, if you've applied to that. Really, any grant that is not the same grant in another borough is still eligible. You're still eligible to apply to Queen's Arts Fund, and we encourage you to apply to as many grants and funding as you see necessary or you would like for your project. So someone's asking for out-of-state travel. Does it include any artists traveling to Queens? So let's say your project is an artist collaboration, is what I'm assuming. So your collaborators, again, they can be based outside of Queens, but you can't use grant funds to, let's say, pay for their train ticket to Queens if they're out of state, or pay for them to fly into New York. So any grant funds essentially spent has to be Queens based. Great, and so can I submit more than one Newark artist application? For example, if one is for a collaboration and one is for an individual project? No, so you can only submit one application per year, and that's for if you're applying in, let's say you're both a writer and a musician, you can't apply for 2 separate projects, and you can apply for an artist group and your own individual project in 1 year. If you did receive a 2021 Queen's Arts Fund grant as an individual artist, and this year you want to be part of a collective, or vice versa, you applied as a collective last year and received the grant, you can apply this year, but you cannot be essentially funded twice for 2 projects. Really great questions. Thanks, everyone. So why can't students apply? Are there any exceptions? So as I said, students cannot apply as individual artists. And I know this is restrictive. This is an eligibility requirement that comes from the city. And because these grants are publicly funded, they have certain restrictions like student restriction that you might not find with privately funded grants or other grants. I apologize, and I hope it changes in the future. But I do want to say that if you are planning on being part of an artist group and you're a student and you're collaborating with another Queens artist, that person can apply for your group. You can still be part of the project that receives funding, but you just can't be an individual artist applying or a lead applicant. And our grants taxed as income for the lead applicant or the main applicant. So generally, these grants are considered taxable income, and you will be required to submit a W-9 form if you are awarded the grant. But I encourage folks to reach out to any artist tax support for specific tax information. It might be different for you. Yeah, I just encourage folks to reach out for their individual tax needs. But generally, yes, these grants are considered taxable income. And you don't have to report the tax amount in your budget. But if you do, that won't make your application ineligible. If you don't, it also won't make it ineligible. We understand that it may depend on an individual basis. I'm just going to take 1 second to read through some new questions. Oh, great. So someone asked, is this grant available for online performances? Yes, so we'll get a little bit more into what your public component will look like for this project or public sharing of work. But yes, that's new from past QAF grants, virtual performances or virtual projects, online projects are permissible for grant funding. They must include a live component. So let's say you film a performance or a play and you want to live stream it, that's okay, but you need to have some kind of live component like an artist Q&A or some option for the public to interact with you as the artist if it is a virtual event. And if it's virtual, you might ask, how is it specific to Queens audiences? So you show that you are directing your project to a Queens-based audience, you market towards a Queens-based audience. And yeah, if you have any specific questions about if a virtual or online project is permissible, feel free to reach out to me over email. I know it can be a bit confusing. And so can you design a project to take place in different parts of Queens that you reside in or have your studio in? Yes, so if you are based in one Queens neighborhood and you want your project to be put on in another neighborhood, that is permissible. I would keep in mind for projects that are participatory or have a really specific target community or audience, if you plan to make that project, consider why are you putting it on in that neighborhood, or why do you want to reach that community? What is your relationship to that community, those people, or that place? We really encourage that folks put on or share their work and bring in folks for their audience or community into their work that they have long sustainable relationships with, and show that those relationships exist in your application. And we'll get a little more into that when we go through the walkthrough, but that's a really great question. And then, can you give honorariums to collaborators in other states? Yes, so you can use it to pay artists who reside in another state. So let's say you hire or you have a dancer who's part of your project, you're choreographing a project, and you bring in a dancer who lives in New Jersey, let's say. You can use the grants fund to pay those folks. You just can't use them for travel. This grant, someone asked, can this grant be used to make an NFT? No, this grant cannot be used to make an NFT. That is not eligible. But someone asked, is podcasting eligible? Yes, podcasting is considered an artistic discipline. And for specific questions, again, about your project discipline, if you're uncertain, please email me and I can share a bit more specific information about that discipline. If it seems gray, which would be considered eligible for the newer grant, which would not. And just want to reiterate that if you've applied in previous years, but have not received a grant, though you are considered a funding priority along with new applicants. Only folks who have received a newer grant in the past are not prioritized in this process over folks who this would be their first time receiving funding from Queen's Arts Fund. So you have, if you've applied in the past and you haven't received a grant, I encourage you to apply again. And about 43% of applications that were funded last year were folks who applied first and were denied and then applied again and received funding. Great, so take a few more minutes if folks have questions and want to ask. And I'm seeing a few more questions in the chat, but they're a little bit specific. So again, I encourage folks to email me. Yeah, and so we'll take about 3 to 4 more minutes to open for questions, and then we'll take a short break. As a reminder, if you have specific application questions or project questions, we'll get into those after the application walkthrough. These are about eligibility and permissible project types. And so I'm seeing a hand from Michael. And sorry, just one moment. Great, so yeah, if you have any questions, please use the reaction button to raise your hand. And Michael Feinberg, do you have a question or? All right, we'll move to Charlene.
Hi, is a budget form needed for this grant? I didn't see the budget form.
No, so if you've applied in the past, there was a longer budget form, and this year, the newer grant, there is still a budget section asking you what you'll use the grant for, but you do not have to fill out the budget form. And again, we'll get into that in our application walkthrough, but the form itself is not required.
Okay, what about when we're doing the final report, do we need, if we granted, do we need to show the receipt to prove for the expense?
Yeah, so you do not have to show receipts for your grant. We do ask you for specific item costs that you use the grant for if you are awarded, but we do not require submissions of receipts or I guess proof of spending.
How much is the expense for the grant? For the material expense? Or is all included together?
I'm not sure of your question. I do want to move to other folks who have questions, just because we're limited on time. So
is the material fee specific? The percentage in the grant, total grant, just not over 1,000?
Yes, so you can use the grant just on supplies and materials, but no one item can cost more than $1,000. So you can have several items, but as long as they're all individually under $1,000.
Okay, thank you.
No problem. And then I saw Mariana. You have a question?
Yeah, hi. I'm just curious, if you receive the grant, could you produce an event that then you charge a fee and then you make profit on it, or is this just you use the grant and then that's it, you have to produce with the money that you have?
Yeah, so for your question, for your event, for your public component, you can charge a fee. So let's say you're putting on a concert or a show, you can charge an admission fee. We do suggest that, or I guess projects that have free admission or sliding scale admission or are donation based. So basically the option to access it either free or low cost, rather than, let's say, an event that costs $20 or $25 to attend is prioritized. And then also if you are making work, so you've produced paintings or you produce an album, you can sell your work as well for this grant. There's no restriction on if you want to sell books, music, artwork as part of it. But for your public event, we do encourage that you make it free or low cost.
Okay, so just to attach another question, are there going to be venues that will participate with the grantees? Like,
Yeah,
because
so,
venues
sorry.
cost a lot of money, so most of your funds go to the rental of a space if you want to do a live performance.
Yes, definitely. So venues can be quite costly. And I guess for your question, I'm hearing two parts of it. We don't partner with any venues to offer free space, unfortunately, at this time. I'm hoping that that is something that's possible in the future. We do have a venue list that's listed on our website of venues that venues in Queens. We're expanding it and it has contact information. And there's a variety of like low cost venues to higher fees. And those are listed there as well, like how much the venue may cost to rent or produce a show at. You can put on your event at a non-traditional venue, so to say. So it can be somewhere that isn't a traditional performance venue, or it could be in a public space, a public park, which I know there are permit fees for, but it doesn't necessarily have to be at a traditional space. You can also produce something that is online or lower cost. Yeah, but I do know that venue fees are expensive. And yeah, I encourage you to look at that list, as there are some options that offer really lower fees. I guess when I'm talking about lower fee venues, I mean under $200 or less to produce an event or to use their space. Great, thank you. So apologies, we'll take about a 4-minute break and then we'll return and we'll go through the application narrative section.
Can I please have my question answered? I'm sorry.
Oh, sorry, who's speaking?
This is Michael, and I've typed my question in the chat, and you called on me, and you never answered my question.
Sorry, I didn't hear you. But yes, please ask your question and then we'll take a short break after.
Yes, so I've applied many times in the past. I've never received funding. I'm a recording artist, so I make albums. And I'm wondering if the reason why I'm not being selected is that I need to change my focus to the public aspect of the release or a performance related to the recording.
Yeah, so this is a bit of a more specific question towards your project. but I do want to remind you and other folks that
I think it relates to anyone who has a project that's a film recording, podcast, anything like that,
so
because
yes,
the
I will
public
answer.
performance is not
Sorry.
the primary impetus.
Great. So I will answer your question. Please let me do so. So the this grant is for two parts, as I said before, for you to make your work. So for you to make your recorded piece or make your recordings and to share it publicly. So you have to have an event to share what you've recorded. It can be a listening party where you talk to folks about how you made the recording, for example. It can be part of a group show or a group event with other recording artists. But in addition to making that recording, you have to share it with the public in some way. And again, that sharing the public must include a live component, so you can't simply just upload the recording to the internet. Great, so we will take a break until 12:26, and we'll come back and we'll go through the application, and then we'll answer any specific questions you have about the application narrative after we do the walkthrough. All right, so we'll get started with an application walkthrough now. And if someone can just give me thumbs up, reaction that you can hear me, we're good to go, that would be great. Great. So as we go through this section, again, if you have any questions in the chat, I see some new questions too. Please drop your questions in the chat as I go through this, and we'll go through similarly, reading questions and then taking some from the floor. And again, this meeting is being recorded and will be shared next week. So if you want to review it, you'll have access to it. And with that reminder that folks who have their videos on or ask questions, that you are being recorded. If you do not want to be part of the recording, simply drop your question in the chat and I'll read it off. Great. So again, just want to reiterate, keeping with time, will take about 15 minutes to go through this section, 15 to 20 minutes, and then use the remaining of the time to answer questions. So about 15, 20 minutes for questions. And so how are applications scored? Panelists are sent evaluation criteria and score applications based on the information you provide in your application. Going through this criteria before we start the walkthrough, there's 4 points: creativity and artistic vision, community engagement and support, equity and access, and feasibility. So these are a little bit different than the evaluation criteria in past QAF cycles. And evaluation criteria comes from other communications with other arts councils in New York City, as well as advice from our advisory committee that meets in the fall to help review and plan for this year's cycle. So creativity and artistic vision. I'm just going to take a step back and say it's really helpful to refer to these criteria when writing your application and then reviewing it, making sure that it meets all these points. And you think it answers all these questions, as this is what panelists are using to score your application and what will ultimately determine if you receive funding. So I'm going to share it in the chat quickly. Great. So creativity and artistic vision, you demonstrate that your project, through your project description and the work samples you provide, it should say individual artist statement is aligned with your project's goals. So you show that this project basically fits within your timeline as an artist. Either it helps you grow in the work that you've already been making, or will pivot you to the place that you want to be in your artistic path, if it's maybe a new work or genre. Community engagement and support. So projects that can clearly identify their audience or the community they're trying to reach do much better in panel process. And so it doesn't have to be for all Queen's audience members or the general Queen's public, but it does have to be for a Queen's audience. And again, if this is a project that you plan on having community members be part of the project or a participatory project, bringing folks in to the thing that you are making or presenting, I encourage you to look at your relationships and consider how long have these relationships existed? Are you and your audience or community, to say, benefiting? Is there mutual benefit? And is it sustainable? Will it last beyond the purpose of this project? Does it uplift you both? Equity and access. So your project is easily accessible to your target audience in a diverse Queens community in terms of disability, culture, geography, and economic accessibility, like we talked about before. And both your project, sorry, reading through this, but both, so your project, if it again is participatory, it centers people and communities that have been most marginalized by our society's inequitable systems and structures. And when we talk about community and folks who are most marginalized in arts funding, we mean that community is can be considered a collection of people, places, and organizations that are connected through some external factor like geographic location, culture, identity. And when we talk about folks who have been most marginalized or communities most marginalized or underrepresented in arts funding, we're talking about Black and Indigenous artists, artists of color, disabled folks, people who are part of the LGBTQAI community, immigrants, elderly folk or senior citizens, people who are part of religious minorities, just to clarify, and that section really speaks also to our funding priority. And again, we do ask panelists to keep our funding priorities in mind when they're reviewing applications, as well as this valuation criteria to score applications. And lastly, the feasibility and clarity of your application. Show the panel that you're capable of doing what you propose, that it makes sense for you to be funded this $3,000 grant award, and that you can successfully put on and produce the project that you describe in your application. How do you do this? Your project timeline is clear. Your budget shows that you understand the expenses that your project that you will need to fund in order to put your project on. And you have a general understanding of the steps from start to finish that will need to be taken in order to make a completed project by the end of 2022 or an earlier timeline that you set. So just a little bit of how to access the application. And again, I'm just going to share those links that I shared again in the chat, along with a link to the application. So to access the application, you can go on QCA's website and click the grants and commissions, and you're going to click Queens Arts Fund section. And then you'll be brought to the QAF homepage where you'll find a link to the application. If you scroll down on this page, you'll find information about the Arts Access Grant and Newark Grant, about the panel process. A link to the nomination or panelist nomination form is there as well. And I encourage you to look at the website again before sending in your application, or if you have any general questions that you want answered about the grants, probably find there. So when you click apply now on our webpage, you're brought to our submittable page where you'll see all of our open applications. And for the Newark grant, you'll click submit to QCA. The panelist nomination form again can be found there as well. And if you don't have a submittable account, filling out this part is important. It'll help you make your submittable account, and then you'll be able to apply, and you'll use that account to work on your application draft and then submit. If you have a submittable account, you'll have to log in first and then fill out this application. And then we'll go through the entire application, applicant information section, but for this part, we ask for your individual artist name or collective name, and then your applicant legal name. So for your individual artist name or collective name, if you're applying as a group, put your collective's group name there. If you have a name that you go by or an artist name, this is basically the public facing name that QCA will use. If you are awarded and we're sharing information about your project on our website or on social media, that's the name that you want folks to see. And then your applicant legal name is either your legal name as an individual artist or the lead applicant's name. And this name is only used for documents like contracts, payments, internal use by QCA, and it's not shared with the public. Great. So artist information, your artist statement. Your artist statement should really speak to what you make and how you make it. A little bit of why you make it is also great. So I find it helpful to either work from what you make and then describe your work and a little bit of background of why you make that work, or you can work the other way. Why do you make art? What do you do? What art are you making and how do you make it? But if you're confused about artist statement, if you haven't written one before, there's a lot of really helpful guidelines on the internet. I like to use the Creative Independence guidelines, and I can share some resources over email when I send out this recording to folks. And moving along, who are your artistic collaborators? So if this is an individual project, you'll just say self. But if this is in a collaboration, you're applying as a group, who else are you applying with? And what are their roles in this project? And give a little bit of background as to what their experience is as well. Or I would say if you're applying as an individual artist, but you have your choreographer and you have dancers, 3 dancers, listing their names here as well would be helpful. This really serves to give panelists an idea of who is making your project happen, and a little bit of information about them helps really show panelists that you have an understanding of the folks needed to make your project happen and that they have the experience along with you to help you produce your project. Great, so this application narrative section, this is the bulk of your application, these questions that we're going to go over. And basically this should paint a really clear picture about what your project is, what your public component is, and how you're going to make it and how it will look like when it's finished. Additionally, how will you share it with the public, and who will you be sharing it with? So overall, it answers who, what, where, and when of your project. And I encourage you to really look through this section and make sure all the pieces fit together, so to say. It's helpful to have someone else read it through before submitting it. Asking a friend to basically see, does it make sense what you're going to make and how you're going to share it? So project discipline, again, as I said, self-described, and the discipline that you choose will determine which panel group you're put into or your application is reviewed in. So we try to have applications that choose similar disciplines reviewed in panel together. So let's say you are working on a literary project. Your project will be reviewed along with other literary projects applying to the newer grant. And your project overview, that is what really gives a very short, succinct idea of what your project is. If someone was reading a quick blurb about your project, that would be it. And we use that to share on our website if you are awarded the grant. Great. So your project description. This part is really the main part of your application. It gives an idea of what your project is about. So a little bit of like a synopsis, so to say, and also what you are making. For example, if you're writing a play, it tells a little bit of the story of what the play is, who are the characters involved, and then what form it is. Are you going to finish a script and then produce, is it a finished script or is it a section of a script? Are you putting on a reading? Are you putting on a whole production? This section really gives a general idea of what your project is, the idea of it, and then what it will look like when it's done. And yeah, I just wanted to reiterate again, this is a really important part of your application. If you're stuck on the other parts, maybe come to this section first and write this out, write the other parts out to fit along with your project description, and then look back and see if they all match. Your project location and your public component. So here, this is where you'll describe what the public component of your project will be. How are you going to share the work that you're making? And where will you be sharing it? Is it at a venue? Is it online? List that here. And overall, we understand that projects sometimes need to change. So you're planning to have it at one venue. You don't need to have a venue confirmed, but the more information that you can share, more concrete details. So you share that you're thinking of having it at a specific place, or you're thinking of having it at a public park, and you show that you know that you need to pay venue fees or permit. That's helpful, even if you don't have them confirmed, so to say. And then your project timeline. So this part is how you will put your project on. So what are all the steps necessary for you to make your project? Again, if it's a work in progress, what are the steps necessary to bring it to a finished project? And then what dates will they happen at? Basically, either list out dates. I like to work backwards. So this is when I'd like to finish my project, and then work back from there to see when do I need to start the soonest in order to finish my project at the time that I want to finish it. And as a reminder, these projects do need to be completed by the end of 2022. And you also need to hold your public event before the end of 2022 as well. Great. And then target audience. Who are you trying to reach with your project? Who is this project intended for? Or you can ask, if this project is intended for yourself and making it, who's the public component intended for? Like I said before, projects that have a specific target audience. So you've really thought about, who do you want to see this project? Why do you want them to see it? Why is it important for a specific audience to view your work? How will it impact them? Sharing this information here helps show panelists that you have thought about how your project will work in the greater world outside of your own practice. And then marketing strategy. How will you make sure that your target audience or community will know about your project and hear about it. And then project goals. This part is, again, where you show how this project really fits into where you want to grow as an artist, or how you want to deepen your creative practice. So again, how does this project help you reach that place? And I recommend after writing your project goals, you can write this first and work backwards, but make sure, look at your project description and your artist statement. These 3 sections should connect the project goals, project description, and artist statement. Who are you as an artist? What are you making, and how will it, why is it important for you to make this project at this point in time? This is a great way to make sure your application is succinct and it answers the first criteria section, creativity and artistic vision. And then COVID-19 contingency plan. So this part is where you'll describe if your project is being put on and there's a surge in COVID-19 cases like we're in right now, how will you transition your project to happen in a way that's safe and compliant with state or city imposed restrictions? And if you need to pause your project because it may be unsafe to continue, how will you pause it? And then how will you make sure that you can continue your work in the future? So this might look like bringing a live performance online, or filming a performance. It might look like transitioning from a concert to a listening session, or if you're part of, let's see, a reading, an online reading instead of a reading at a local space. And in general, just QCA understands that things change. So your application, things can change in your application or your project if you are awarded the grant, as long as the overall project looks similar to what you present in your application. That's fine. There are a lot of moving parts, and we understand that sometimes changes need to be made in order for you to either make your project or just to live as a person or artist. These grants are flexible, but the main purpose is that your project that you're proposing will look like the project that you finish at the end of the year if you are awarded the Newark grant. Great. And then project budget. So like I said, the budget form is not required this year if you've applied in past years for the Newark grant. But we do want to see an itemized breakdown of what you will use the grant funds for. So here you can see a sample budget, and your budget should equal $3,000, the amount of the grant. And again, before filling this in and submitting your application, strongly encourage you to look at the guidelines to make sure that the expenses that you say you'll use the grant for are eligible expenses. And then just quickly about work samples, we're not going to go in depth, but you are required to submit at least 2 work samples. There's maximum of 6 work samples that you can submit. And these work samples should really show your creativity and your work as an artist. They don't have to be, if you're applying with a project, they don't have to be the specific project or in the specific like type of project that you're applying with, but they should show your creativity, and they support your application narrative and showing panelists that you're able to make work that you're proposing. Great, so We'll take questions again. We'll start by reading some questions in the chat and then go from some questions on the floor. Again, if you have specific questions about your project, I'm going to ask you to email me, and we're going to try to take more general questions for this section. Great, so someone asked for the public component, what is the timeline it needs to happen within? So the public component can happen at any point in time within the calendar year, but it should be a presentation of your completed project. So again, in your project description, you're explaining what your project will look like when it's done, and your event or public component should be a sharing of that completed project. You can have a series of public events, or let's say a series of workshops and a presentation. That's permissible as long as you have at least one event that shows the completed work before the end of the year. Can you change collaborators in the future? So let's say you're planning to work with someone on your project, and they decide that they no longer want to work with you on this project. Or let's say you don't have confirmed collaborators, but you have an idea of folks that you want to reach out to. You've been in conversation about bringing them into the project you're proposing. That's okay. Your collaborators can change as long as it doesn't affect the overall project that you're proposing. So if someone's a really key component to your project, I would say no, that would affect the project proposal. But if you're applying with your project and you want to, let's say, bring a singer in, I recommend being specific. So sharing names, sharing roles again of collaborators if you have any, but it is okay if those change if you are awarded the grant. Great, so someone asked, I'd like to apply with a short film, which I would do with one free community screening for. Should the application overall focus on the community event or focus on the project? So your application should focus on describing what your project is, but use that public component section to describe what your community event will look like. So for example, I like to think of it as if I'm going to eventually create an event description online for my project, what is it that I'm going to tell folks that this event is about? I need to know what my project is before I can create an event. But I also do need to share a bit of information about what that event will look like as well. And then, does the budget have to focus on the community event or public component, or on the cost of the project? So the budget should encompass both parts. So what do you need to make your project happen, and what do you need to put on your public event? This grant, we understand that it's not an incredibly large grant, so it doesn't need to cover all project costs. The items that you list in your budget section should just be what you want this grant to be used for. So your overall project budget might be, or event budget might be larger than the grant itself. But for the purpose of this application and grant, just share what you plan to use the grant funds for as part of that overall project budget. Great, so In terms of work samples, there is a 5-minute limit. And just want to share with work samples, if you're sharing audio or video and it has a password, make sure that you include that password so that panelists can access it. If you do share work samples and we're not able to resolve problems accessing it before panels, then unfortunately your application will be reviewed without that work sample. And then just want to reiterate, someone's asking which specific neighborhoods constitute as South Queens, Eastern Queens, priority neighborhoods, so to say. So really neighborhoods that have received funding, QA funding in the past, a majority of funding, are Astoria, Jackson Heights, Long Island City, Ridgewood, Maspeth. Those neighborhoods have received a disproportionate amount of funding compared to who's applied in the past. So other neighborhoods outside of that in South Queens, Jamaica, St. Albans, Flushing, Corona, Elmhurst, Rockaways. That's not all neighborhoods that are funding priorities, but are some neighborhoods that we mean by that. And then, yeah, so we'll take about 10 more minutes to open to the floor if folks have more questions. And again, if you have any specific questions, feel free to email me. I'll also be sharing resources I mentioned along with this recording after the session next week. So yeah, if folks have any questions, I'm trying to get questions from folks who haven't asked questions before, just to make sure I reach everyone. I see a hand from Selma. Just give me 1 second. Great. So yeah, Selma, if you have a question.
Yes, hi. I'm still a little confused about the audience, like how you target, if you have to target, or if you do a dance performance, right? And well, you just want to share. You want to share with the community you are, but you want to share, like Queens is huge. What if I am in one neighborhood and I find a place to perform in another neighborhood inside Queens? You know, how can I target an audience when it can be general? Like if I make the event open free, even in a theater or very low cost, it's for me it's confusing how I'm going to put my relationship with the audience in there. You know what I mean? If I'm not, for example, I'm not targeting Latino audience or I don't know, I'm not target, I'm open. But I am from one neighborhood and find a place to perform in another neighborhood. How do I justify that?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I guess I hear a little bit, 2 parts to your question. For your audience, or there's a distinction maybe between audience and then maybe audience or community members that you're bringing into your project. So if you have a project that having other people be involved in your project is really essential, then that's what we mean by explain your relationships with those folks. But if your project is just you working on your project and then sharing it with public, I would consider audience, and it can be a general audience, but when you think about who might come to see your work or be interested in seeing your work, who is that? If it is a general public, why might it be just a general public? Why might generally folks in Queens be interested in your project? Does that make sense? A little bit of that. It can be a general audience, but showing like who might want to come to your specific event or show, etc. is helpful for panelists to see that you have a sense of who usually comes to see your work when you share it.
Okay. All right, thank you.
Okay, yeah, no problem. And then, do you have any other questions from folks? Again, going to try to call in folks who did not ask questions before. Great, so someone asked if it's a spoken word or music collaboration or performance, can there be other artistic guest presence to perform? Yes, so this is a great question speaking to who can be involved, I think, with your public event. You can have other, let's say you're having a concert and you want to show your work in that concert. You can be working on your own music yourself and then have a concert with other artists who are not part of the grant. They don't have to be part of your project to be part of your public event. And with that said, you don't have to produce your public event yourself. So let's say there is a group show that you want to be part of and you want to show your work there. Or let's say you're making a zine and there's a zine fair happening in Queens that you would like to table as part of. Or another example is a local bookstore, someone's hosting a reading and you want to read your new work that you've made as part of this grant. Those are all ways that you can share your work publicly and fulfill that public component part of the grant. But you don't have to make an event yourself if that's not something you're interested in using this grant for. So I think options are broad, and really if there's an event in Queens that incorporates art, it doesn't even have to be an art focused event. We've had folks who have shared their work as part of an open street festival in Queens. That also is permissible as long as it happens somewhere in Queens, or if it's virtual, targeted towards a Queens audience, and it happens within 2022 calendar year, that fulfills the grant requirements for the public component. And I'll take a few more questions if any folks have any. And I see hand raised by Anne.
Yes, I also put this in the chat too, so you can ignore this question in the chat. I was just wondering if you're a previous grant winner. We won with a project in 2020. The project got postponed because of the pandemic and we had to change things, so it's not done yet. But if we won a grant in 2020, the QAF grant in 2020, and we don't live in one of the prioritized regions, are we encouraged not to apply for this grant? Or yeah, and I was just wondering what percentage of the grants are awarded to the non-prioritized categories?
Yeah, thank you for that question. So we encourage you still to apply to the grant. Funding priorities aren't to exclude folks who maybe don't fit into those priorities, but they're there mostly to look at who has received funding in the past and make sure these grants are reaching everyone who are applying, trying to work towards, I guess, a more equitable administration of these grants. So please, yes, do apply, even if you don't fit in those funding priorities. And sorry, you had a second part of your question that I think I missed.
Sure, yeah, I was just curious what percentage of the grants do non-prioritized candidates usually make up?
Yeah, so there's no set percentage of the grants that are awarded that non-prioritized applications will receive versus prioritized applications. It really depends on who is applying each cycle. But to share, like these grants last year, 105 artists were awarded the new grant and about 240 applied. So they are still competitive grants, but they're maybe not as competitive, I would say, as folks might think. It's not just 10 grants for hundreds of applications. So if you apply with your project, I think you're still, there's still a higher chance that you might receive funding. And you're scored against those applications in the panel that you're reviewed in. So you're scored against about 20 to 30 other applications that are similar discipline to that of your own project.
Okay, thank you. And can you just, I know you mentioned this earlier, I forgot the number, how much you said the total amount is available for funding this year?
Yeah, so total amount of funding that Queen's Arts Fund will distribute for both the Newark grant and Arts Access grant is around $460,000. And just under $400,000 around that will be administered for Newark grants, similar to last year.
Thank you.
No problem. And does anyone else have any questions? I'm not.
Yeah,
seeing-
I have a question. Can I ask him or I asked before?
Yeah, if you've asked your question before, I'm going to ask that you share it
No,
over.
I have a different question.
Okay. Yes. What's your question?
My question is my target audience is older adults, Chinese American speaking audience. And I have a talk about the specific senior center to hosting a workshop, but this is so will become non-eligible because it's in their senior centers.
So you can have your project be targeted towards senior center residents, but you have to have some part of your project be open to the general public. So for example, if you're hosting workshops with residents at a senior center, then that's okay. But then you have an event where residents will share their work with the public, that would be eligible for this grant. If it's only for members of a specific senior center, that is not eligible for this grant.
No, the final presentation is going to be open a view for public. Yeah, all the senior from Queens are welcome to join the workshop and open view for general public. So it's okay.
Yeah, so a project like that, so final presentation that's open to all seniors.
Yes.
Is
Yeah, no, to all the Queens residents.
yes.
Yeah, whoever wants to view is fine, but the workshop is specific in that senior center member. It's okay, right?
Yes, so just going to share that this is a great example that you can have a project that's targeted to a specific community or demographic in Queens, and then have your final presentation be open to the public, as long as it's not specific to only a group or a members only access. So as long as folks in general public can be part of the project you're putting on, that is permissible for this grant. And so we are at the end of time for this session. I'm just